Welcome to the Meetings Podcast, the meeting organizer's podcast source for what's new in the meetings and events industry. Meetings Podcast is a conversation with a variety of voices that looks at events, meetings, and media. Meetings Podcast is sponsored by IMEX America, America's worldwide exhibition for incentive travel, meetings, and events.
Welcome back to the Meetings Podcast. This is Mike McAllen from Grass Shack Events and Media, and I have John Trask from Grass Shack Events and Media. Hi, John.
Hello there.
We were going to do a podcast today called Rethinking the Events Industry.
And we've been rethinking it for a little while before we even rethink it here live.
That's true. So we've had several things happen recently, and we were I went to the BizBash in LA. We did some podcasting for them, and I went down and checked out the show, and I was walking through the trade show registration area, actually right in front of the registration area, and there was Elizabeth Glau, who most of the listeners know of from actually doing a lot of podcasts with you, John.
Yes.
She lives down there in Los Angeles with you. We passed this sign, and I wanted to read off what it said. Planners are it's this big sign that was right in front of the registration. Planners are defined as independent professional planners, corporate planners, or association organization planners, full-time or part-time. This does not include suppliers or vendors that are also event planners. BizBash reserves the right to determine if an attendee falls into the category of planner or non-exhibiting supplier. So that kind of was something that kind of opened up a can of worms, not a can of worms, but got the conversation going between Elizabeth and I, because we had this conversation before the IMEX, and you guys did a podcast actually together talking about that.
Yes.
And then I remember Karina Bauer, who is the CEO of IMEX, was on the podcast, and she kind of came on to kind of address that, which I thought was interesting. I mean, she was really nice of her, and they really are big on. And they are a sponsor of this podcast. I'm not kissing her ass because they're a sponsor of this podcast. It's just that I thought that was very interesting that she came on. Actually, that was before she was a sponsor of the podcast.
Yes.
That's why we let them sponsor us because of that, actually. But anyway, it kind of was an interesting thing. And then you had sent me a link to a blog post today, which kind of tied into this whole thing, which got us talking. So we thought, let's record a podcast about it.
Yeah, it's and by the way, it's nice to be back on the podcast actually with you, because I think it's been a while since we've done one with both of us actually on it.
It has. It's been a long time.
So that's kind of cool. I'm glad to be doing this live with you today.
Well, welcome back, John, and welcome me back, because I guess we just haven't done it together.
We're both welcome back by each other or something. But no, this was I found a link. It actually was a link to a bit older of a blog post. It's been up for a while, but I found it on an MPI group on LinkedIn that I belong to, and it's from someone in Italy who runs a website called the Eventagist. And the question it posed was, who's the real buyer and who deserves to be a hosted buyer? And this is a conversation I've had with other people in the past as well, because the measure of a hotel buyer of a hosted buyer tends to be hotel rooms. And so you can be a planner of all sorts of experience or of various disciplines within the industry, but in general, if you're not booking hotel rooms, you're never going to get hosted. So that tied right back into this photo and just some of the other conversations we've been having. So I guess that's sort of why we ended up on this topic today of, rethinking things and what are suppliers and what are planners and what are hosted buyers. Yeah. That being said, what is a planner, Mike?
Yeah, no, it is interesting because the lines are really blurred here because, in the past, I don't have any designations. I've been taking no real classes, and I'm not being a meeting planner. But yet, my company and I have done all the meeting planning there is to do on many, 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 many events for years and years and years. Yet I'm not a planner. but I don't really have any. It's interesting. And then you, on the other case, have your CMP and your CMM, and you're not really a planner either. But I mean, you are a planner. You're a certified meeting planner. You have the designation at the end of your name. But
yeah, by that definition, I'm not a planner. I don't book hotel rooms in the regular course of my business.
Yeah, and so it kind of goes back to what the meeting planner is, and they're actually planning meetings. So is that logistically, or is that for what am I trying to say? Is it logistics, or is it actual like engagement at the event? Right. Are you actually building? Are you part of the event design, I guess?
Right, because I mean, what you've done for years, even before you and I started working together, is put together a lot of things on engagement and a lot of programs that are designed to create a certain goal within a meeting. And to me, should be much more of a planner's role than just the booking of doing contracts to book a room or doing contracts to schedule a meal or things like that.
Yeah, and you had said too, which we had talked about a little bit earlier, like, the meeting planners wanted to get away from being called a party planner.
Right.
And that's kind of what that BizBash thing to me was more of. Like, it was really interesting to walk through the trade show. There were all these cool different things that you could use on events, and I could see where if you could tie that into your theme of your event or whatever they're having that meeting about, it's cool to be able to see the new ideas. When you go to an MPI or PCMA, which I've been to before with you and probably some of the listeners, that's all hotel rooms and venues. It's interesting.
Well, and I mean, that's, to me, has been one of my concerns since we did shows back when MPI was in Orlando, which I think was a couple years ago. And they increased the dues to suppliers, and basically just there really isn't a clearly defined supplier planner role anymore. And almost all of these organizations, to me, are still clinging to this model where, you either plan meetings or you either supply meetings. And I think the reality is the vast majority of people in this industry do a bit of both at this point, depending on how you define planning, of course.
Right.
Because,
and actually, as you're talking about that, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm thinking that maybe the suppliers should be broken into different groups.
Right.
Instead of the planners. I didn't even think about this till you said that right now, because, I understand MPI, PCMA. The people who have money are the people with the hotel rooms. They're the venues and the hotels, and Hilton Hotel and Marriott and all of them come.
Right.
Huh.
And so, I mean, on one hand, you want to have almost no designations, and on the other, you want to have very specific designations because, I can supply planners with certain services. I can purchase certain services from other suppliers, but I'm just not in the middle of the transactions that happen with booking a hotel room. I'm in a different set of transactions, so it's almost like a transactional classification.
Yeah, interesting. Because and then on the backside of that too, now that I'm thinking about it again, is that I hire meeting planners.
Right.
Like, I'm hiring meeting planners. Like, a lot of the meeting planners that are invited to go to these things, I hire them.
Exactly. and that's where it gets in.
Or we hire them. I'm sorry, we do it together now. Yeah, it's interesting. So then we kind of looked at this a little bit more, and then we talked about that spin group, which we thought was kind of interesting because it really that's really taking it to another level of, kind of being elitism or elite. They're kind of an elite. They bill themselves as an elite group, and I was a member of that for a long time. And then you couldn't get into it,
right?
Which was very strange. And you're the one with the CMP, CMM,
right,
designation, and it's for planners. And you've been in the industry for a long time. Not to say that you're old or anything, John, but you've been
at a very young age. When I started back at the age of 8 in the industry.
So, and then after kind of looking at their site, it was interesting to find out that So I was kicked out of the group too. There's no sour grapes here about that at all. But I was kicked out, which I thought was so funny because I had been in the group. I had gone to their meetings. Like, I've actually attended the meetings.
Right.
And then I was kicked out, and they apologized to me. Well, that's just the way they're doing that now. They're kicking out all the suppliers. You have to be. And then I find out after reading this website today is that the founder of the thing, her whole business on the side is teaching suppliers the inside secrets to getting to meeting planners. So she's invited all these. I mean, I've invited to start in the group, and then I guess they got enough meeting planners in there where they didn't need the suppliers. Now you still can be in there if you're a supplier, but you're a preferred supplier, and it's really, really expensive to get access to them. So, anyway, I just thought that's interesting. That's an association now that is kind of and it's actually brilliant because it was a brilliant business play. Now you pay. Now the suppliers are paying her to get access to that group, basically. So I think that's very cool the way she did this. It's not very cool, actually. It's kind of weird, but it's cool that she's begun. But then that also comes down to like how many groups there are, associations that are in this whole industry. You go to like that CIC website, and you and I were like looking at it. It's like there's 32 associations just in their partner associations, I guess, for the Convention Industry Council. And that's not even counting like BizBashes or ISIS or any of those. ISIS is in there. You said that.
Yeah, ISIS is in there. We were just talking about various organizations that we know of and sort of naming them off. And yeah, it's and I mean the problem that I've had with the elitist part of it is just I don't know. When I joined MPI, I had been in the industry 5 or 6 years. And it wasn't as large an organization back then. And I remember going to the first kind of chapter meeting that I ever went to. And literally back then, there were planners who would turn around and walk away from you if it said supplier on your name badge. It was like wearing, the scarlet letter or something. And I thought over time that attitude might be lessening, but I still feel like there's a group. There are some planners who, after a certain amount of time in the industry, develop this sort of entitled attitude because they get treated very well when they're on site and by the hotels. And it's sort of an elitist attitude where if they want to talk to you, they will. And if they don't, they won't. And I wish things like that would sort of finally fade away because I think that we all need to be partners in this industry. And that, to me, is part of the rethinking of it. Is the smart planners understand they need the suppliers to look good, to do their job right, and to support them, and that it's a team thing, and just because they're the ones who kind of control the process doesn't necessarily make them particularly more skilled or powerful within the meeting that they're putting together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you see that in any group of people, though, too, that some people are just snotty, and that's, you don't really want to talk to those people or even work with them anyway. But I get what you're saying. I totally get what you're saying.
And on the fragmented side of it, we were talking about just how many different organizations there are. And on one hand, you can see there's like a narrow focus where you can say, like we were just talking about, transitionally defining what people do versus just saying supplier. At the same time, I look at some of these organizations and I wonder why there's not been a little more like pooling of resources or something. I mean, within MPI, for example, I belong to a chapter that's set squarely in the middle, about 50 to 75 miles in each direction from 2 other chapters. And I understand the historical reasons why this may have evolved the way that it did. But I wonder if, particularly in an era when budgets have been tightened, if it might not be smarter for those 3 chapters to pool their resources, as they did in April and did their first sort of joint conference with all 3 chapters. But if they could put that together, you have a finite amount of resources, a finite amount of vendors, locations that are willing to donate. A finite number of people who can serve on committees and devote time to it. And I've always thought, well, if you took, not always, but the last few years thought if you took those 3 and molded them into one larger organization, you'd have a lot more strength. You'd have a lot more exposure to the members locally, to other people. I mean, I hardly know people in one of the chapters because I never go to its meetings. There are a couple that I try and attend. But I just think that it would be a better use of resources in sort of the new age that we live in to look at things like that. Why do we have all these organizations that overlap if maybe we could combine them and just do specialty things within a larger umbrella? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. I think that back and forth going to some of these, I mean, I'm still kind of new for the last 4 years or whatever, 5 years, going to these PCMA, MPI kind of things. And I kind of always wondered, like, when I walked into the first MPI, it was all like, this is not the general session and stuff. It was like not really done that, it wasn't what
right.
I'm used to seeing at, but then I was spoiled of coming from large corporate events they had gobs of money, .com times and
right.
and just lots of money, different companies with money to do stuff. And then I was thinking, why aren't they showcasing like the coolest, newest stuff at these? This should be the show that the meeting planners come to see the coolest stuff there is out there. But
right.
as you're saying, all this fragmentation of having 33 different associations, who the hell is in charge of this whole industry? Like I think, too bad there isn't one overpowering one, or like you said, they don't just combine and you go to this one conference. I don't know. I don't know if that's what to do. I don't know if that's
right.
the answer of this whole thing, but it's you had mentioned earlier too about, you had talked to somebody at we'll leave them nameless, but at the CIC event, that this person said most of the planners, they hated to say this to you, they hate to say this, but most of the planners don't know anything about event design. They just know the logistics.
Right.
And I think that's a safe place for some people to be. For a lot of these planners, there isn't that outlook of, design, and I mean, they try and do it at these meetings, but there should be more education, I guess, around it, or.
And it's challenging because having been on the education committee for the CIC event that we just did, I mean, one of the topics we talked a lot about was meeting design, and there aren't that many people that you can access who have a base of knowledge, who are speakers who can come talk about it.
That's true, and that is, and I've noticed going to these event things, it's the same speakers at every one, talking about the same stuff, and they are now speakers. They're not actually in the industry. So,
right.
And then that also brought up something that I thought was interesting that we had talked about, was that BizBash, that I went to that and I sat through all the sessions and their kind of general session-y thing they had. And it was basically a pay to speak, pay to play kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And I actually found it I found it good. Just because they were really bringing like case studies and stuff to it. I mean, some of them were really selly, but
right.
if that's that's an interesting game, because I understand that MPI in these places, because I have spoken at them too, and I know you have, but they pay a little bit for you to go to get in front of that audience, but I don't know, you can't sell.
Right.
You're not
right.
allowed to do that. So, though they kind of do, I guess, but now most of the people I kind of see, that's what they do for a living. They travel around to all these places and speak. And
right.
more power to them. I just think that there is another disconnect there in our industry. There's not a lot of people teaching. Does that make sense?
I wonder if there's a way we could reach outside the industry, and it's really challenging and it's uncomfortable territory, but maybe be bringing in some people from entirely different disciplines than meeting planning and finding the commonalities. I mean, I've sat and talked with my wife and people she works with in the insurance business and been struck by the similarity of so many things within our work environment. And like the projects, for example, they were talking about project management, and the thing I'm thinking of, and just how similar it is to the same way that we advance a project or a show through various steps. And so, reaching out, broadening the horizons a little, maybe bring in some people who are experts in adult learning and education, and people who would normally speak to like teachers. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess, and in this there is, when you and I were talking about doing this podcast, it wasn't like going to be a bitch session.
Right.
Kind of try and come around to something, and actually to ask the audience of like, do you have ideas about how we could rethink this? I'd love to get emails about this and just say, or phone calls.
And do more shows on it.
It would be good to kind of just keep on I mean, I don't know. I mean, we kind of said, what are we going to end this talk about, and how are we going to end it? And then you had a good quote from Roger Rickert, which I think you should share.
Well, and before I hit Roger's quote, there was one other point that I really wanted to make, and that's my concern, that are we the only ones who care? Does anybody out there care, or are we shouting in the wind right here? Does the industry not need to be rethought at all? Is it working just fine the way people have it, and are they happy with it? Because, I've had frustrations with budget issues where I've dealt with planners who didn't have the control of their meeting, so their budgets were tightened down, and the general attitude that seemed to come from upper management was, as long as it's good enough, it's okay. And so I've kind of fought back against that for a long time, because I dislike the idea of doing meetings that are just barely adequate and right on the edge of failing because you want to save $100. And so I wonder, but I wonder, am I the only one who feels that way? So I've been looking for some validation. Am I tilting at windmills here myself, and you as well, to try and do better meetings that people aren't really that interested in? And so I really wanted that to be a part of this show too, because I would love feedback from people, as you were just saying, to hear, what do you think? I mean, are we off base here? Are we right? Are we wrong? What is a planner, and what does a planner look like 5 years or 10 years from now, and who's doing that work?
Yeah.
And so, anyway, sorry, but to come back around to what you were asking for about Roger, he did a great session at the CMP Conclave, which, by the way, was an excellent meeting. Great host city in Spokane, wonderful venues, and just a really lot of great networking. I was struck by what a nice place it was, and it was a contrast that I thought of when we were talking about some of the other meetings, in that this was still kind of a narrowly defined group. You had to be a CMP pretty much to be there, but yet at the same time, it seemed to be inclusive of anybody who was a CMP. It wasn't, well, all the planners are going to sit over here and all the suppliers are going to sit over there. It was very much that if you had done the work to get to that point of your career, the door was open. And I had some great conversations with both suppliers and planners. So that was a really cool thing. But Roger, in his advocacy session, said, and I'm going to paraphrase a little, that we aren't doctors, but we bring the doctors together in a room so they can have their ideas and they can innovate and they can create new things. And I think that advocacy kind of carries around to sort of advocating for ourselves and our own business, and how do we prove our worth, and how do we prove that we're not party planners or not just people who know how to schedule what time dinner is going to be.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. It's kind of thinking on the side of like, if you're maybe meeting planners could think of themselves more of like school principals kind of a thing, where they're putting together like the best curriculums for their attendees instead of like getting, because they used to go to school and you'd have the teachers that would do the same thing every year, but then you did have those cool teachers that were kind of did stuff to get you engaged and actually maybe not loving school, but
right,
being
paying
able
attention
to, and maybe collaborating, kind of being actually being involved.
Right.
So anyway, I think this is an interesting topic, and I don't know if there is a quick answer to it, but thanks for talking with me, Jon.
Well, I'm glad we got to do this, and yeah, I don't think there's any quick answer, because we're talking about some very, very large topics. And again, please write to us, call us, send us information through our LinkedIn page, through our Facebook page. We would love feedback, and we'd love to have some people on to talk about this more.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, Jon.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We appreciate and thank you for listening to the Meetings Podcast. Please email with any questions or comments to meetingspodcast@gmail.com. Meetings Podcast is sponsored by IMEX America, America's worldwide exhibition for incentive travel, meetings, and events. The Meetings Podcast theme music is brought to you by the Delgado Brothers, which can be found at delgadobrothers.com.